tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. I've had a lot of more critical things to say about politicians. I was going to say in the last show, but it's really been the last 2 years. But I always try to give credit where it's due. And there's been in Ontario one mayor who's been standing up and speaking out in very clear terms about a lot of the lockdowns. And certainly even a couple of weeks ago when the Omicron panic I mentioned in the previous segment started up, he started to say, well, hang on. I mean, yes, we have to be cautious, but the science and the numbers are not supporting this idea of panic, this knee-jerk reaction. They're certainly not supporting the idea that we have to start closing everything down again. He's been a very good advocate for his constituents, and I'd say for Canadians at large, about being able to stay open and get back to normal through the pandemic. And that is Brampton, Ontario Mayor Patrick Brown, formerly the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. Patrick, it's good to talk to you again. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Yeah, great to join you today.
Now, I think generally speaking, if we go back to the very beginning of the pandemic, we had a fairly unified approach between federal leaders, provincial leaders, municipal leaders. Everyone wanted to work together, cooperate, and get through this. But the longer it's gone on, we've started to see, certainly among Canadians, a great deal of frustration with how some of the public health guidance and advice has come down. And I know you actually were one of the more vocal ones a few weeks back when in the Omicron wave, we saw there was a pretty big gap between, on one hand, this level of panic that we tended to be getting from some people and the story that was actually taking place on the ground, specifically in hospitalizations and in case counts. A lot of people are starting to talk more about it now, this distinction of being in hospital because of COVID and with COVID. But you actually got a fair bit of pushback when you made what was a fairly obvious point, I thought.
Well, I think at the beginning of the crisis, everyone was unified because we didn't know what we were dealing with. And when faced with adversity, Canadians rallied together. But as we've learned more about this virus, we have to adapt based on knowledge. I've always said, follow the science, follow the data, be as transparent as possible, and don't treat the public like children. Tell them the unvarnished truth. And, where there's times I've been frustrated is where I feel we're trying to spin a narrative and not give the full picture. An example of the hospitalizations for me was something that I felt that I needed to push out there because it wasn't being included in the media narrative. I found out just through my own briefings, and I get briefed every week by the hospitals here locally, that half the COVID cases in the hospital were incidental. So if someone went to the hospital with a broken arm, had no symptoms, weren't being treated by COVID, they were counting in the COVID numbers. And the COVID numbers were being used, the COVID hospitalization numbers were being used as a justification for lockdowns. And I just felt this was dishonest, it was disingenuous. And then I found out that it wasn't just my local hospitals that had incidental COVID as 50% of the hospitalized cases. It was at a similar level in every other hospital I spoke to. And I have to give Premier Ford credit. When I put this out there and made this request that they be reported accurately, literally within a day, the health minister and the premier responded and said that they would correct the reporting. And as of now, they've done that. We now get a more accurate picture. But for the lockdown crowd that wants to continue justifying lockdowns, this was what I was suggesting was treason. How dare you give the public the truth? How dare you give the public the unvarnished truth? I just really believe, Andrew, if you want to instill confidence in government institutions, you can't spin them. You can't spin the public. Just tell them the truth. And if you give them the truth and you have to make a tough call, they'll understand and appreciate it. I think when you see more people get skeptical is when you try to spin them and alter the reality of the picture.
Yeah, I think one big example of that is earlier on when, and I don't mean at the very beginning, I mean just as recently as a year ago, when even some outdoor recreation and outdoor gatherings, which we know are very, very safe, were being clamped down. And I know this has been a big thing for you personally. I know you're a very active person. You were a big fan of hockey and all these other sports. And again, we had people that were being told they weren't allowed to gather outdoors, to do things that are fairly safe. And certainly I think there's been a bit more of a trend towards opening up on that. But a lot of Canadians, I think, just tuned out advice when it just wasn't aligning with what we knew was safe in other ways.
Well, let me give you an example. And as you know, I spoke against this last spring, but last spring when the government announced they were closing playgrounds, outdoor recreation, I went to my medical officer of health, who was very cautious. I went to the top infectious disease doctors who are very cautious. And I said, has this been recommended to the provincial government? And they said, no. And I said, is there any science or data that supports this? And they said, no. And that made me feel that at the time, those announcements were really based on PR. The public was worried, so let's do something to make them less worried. But that's not leadership. Leadership is not making an announcement for the sake of PR. It has to be grounded on principle and conviction and data and science. And there was no reason to shut down outdoor recreation. Andrew, let me give you an example. I love tennis. In tennis, you're 76 feet apart. At one point last year, we shut down tennis. Can you imagine the unlikelihood of transmitting COVID 76 feet apart outdoors? It's absurd. And for kids who already had to be out of school, they weren't getting fresh air. Recreation was closed. They weren't getting exercise, which is integral to their, physical wellness. To being told they couldn't even go to the playground, it was preposterous. And, in that case, as much as the government made a mistake, I have to give them credit. With this pushback they heard from physicians and public servants like myself, they corrected course. And I much prefer a government that's willing to admit they made a mistake and correct course than a government that will stubbornly follow the same course.
So let's talk about where we are now, because obviously regions have some level of autonomy, but most of the overarching restrictions and measures are being driven by the province. And in that sense, any municipality in the province is on that train as well. Where would you like to see things now or in the coming weeks? Because we know that we are moving towards some lifting of restrictions, but the vaccine passport was supposed to be gone in January, and that as of now remains in place. Mask mandates, again, we had earlier, I think months ago, heard that they could be lifted as soon as March. I don't know if that's going to happen. Where do you think we should be headed right now on that roadmap to reopening?
I think if you look around the world, economies are reopening. It's time we reopen in Ontario. And Andrew, there are real stories. I get a phone call, every few days from a business that's struggling to stay afloat. I just got a call last night from a very popular gym in Brampton, small business, and they're going under. And, I think of the consequence for the community in that area of the city where there's no other, gym. We're going to lose a level of physical wellness. There are restaurants that have gone under. This isn't just a health pandemic, it's an economic tidal wave. And I don't support the continuation of lockdowns. The data and the science doesn't support it. We've had 2 years to build capacity to handle any increase in COVID cases. And even during this Omicron wave, which was intense, there was a lot more cases. Our ICU capacity wasn't threatened. It wasn't threatened. And, I just feel that we're missing the bigger picture. We are having extreme broad-based lockdowns. And it's like putting a cast on a leg for someone that has a small cut. You could have put a bandage on that on that cut, and I think we're missing. There are huge repercussions in our society. We're going to lose businesses and jobs. There's a mental health and an economic consequence to that. In terms of closing recreation, one of our greatest challenges is rising rates of obesity, cardiac issues. We're going to contribute to that. I actually think there is a consequence to public health by lockdowns that are too harsh. And so if it was up to me, and I've shared this advice, I want to give the Premier credit because he is one of the most accessible premiers, and I've dealt with premiers for a while now. I've been elected for since 2000. you can pick up the phone, you can talk to Doug Ford. And I've had some very direct conversations with him about this. And you know, I just really believe that there's no justification to continue these lockdowns, and I believe they're going to make some movement. I just hope it's not small tinkering around the edges, that we're actually going to see these restrictions lifted.
When we're talking about restrictions, I want to make clear I understand your point here. Obviously, you'd have kids in school and you wouldn't have lockdowns on businesses, but things like the mask mandate and the vaccine passport, do you think those could be lifted right now safely as well?
Yeah, I think we're getting to that point. Let me touch upon each of these. One, on schools, we've lost more school days than any other jurisdiction in North America. There's no justification for losing more school days. In terms of closing businesses and recreation, I think it's time to reopen them. I think we can do so safely. In terms of masks, I do believe that, indoors, that masks can be useful tools to help limit transmission. But with everything, there needs to be a level of reasonableness. I'll put a photo of myself outdoors and someone will say, "Why are you not wearing a mask?" It's because I'm outdoors. Andrew, I have 2 children, and my son is 2.5 years old, Theodore, and I signed him up for a soccer lessons, little kickers. And I got a note from the organizers that the provincial requirements were that they had to wear a mask. It is impossible to have a 2-year-old wear a mask. It is impossible. And so that's why I say there needs to be a level of reasonableness, and where it's appropriate, that wearing a mask can limit transmission, do so. But where it doesn't make sense, there needs to be that level of reasonableness.
And talking about the business impact here, because I know that one thing that you have always done very well in the years that I've known you is try to have relationships with as many different people as possible. I think one time I had a meeting with you and you had, just become from 17 and you probably had 20 more in the rest of the day or something like that. But the reality is businesses are hugely, hugely suffering. You've touched on it earlier with the lockdowns and also I think the unpredictability of it. And I know there have been a number of restaurants that just personally that I've been to in the past couple of years that they made it through lockdown 1, then some closed down in lockdown 2, some made it through that and closed down in lockdown 3. So just in Brampton and in Peel region, what's the story here? I mean, what's happening with these businesses?
People have gone into their savings. They have gone into debt. And there's a huge consequence. Every lockdown, we lose businesses. People have lost their life savings. There's a huge toll. You can't underestimate that toll. And businesses that thought they could handle one lockdown struggled on the second. Every wave gets harder. And this last wave of lockdowns has been devastating. We've lost businesses. People have lost jobs. There'll be people that are on unemployment because of these lockdowns.
So let me just ask you here, because obviously in a parallel universe, it could have been you as premier right now, and I don't want to rehash that. I know you've had to do that as well, but just looking forward, I mean, you're in Brampton, you're doing a lot of work there. I see your updates all the time. Is jumping to federal or provincial politics still something you're open to?
I'm very happy in Brampton, and what I've learned in life is that God has a reason for everything. And I look back to 2018 at the time, I certainly didn't understand some of the false accusations that I had to go through, but everything, honestly has worked out for me. Personally, I've got 2 beautiful children. I got married, and the beauty of being a parent almost makes anything else you do trivial. And so I love my responsibility as being mayor of Brampton. My wife loves the fact that I'm in the same city every night. You mentioned I used to go to 30 events a day across the province. That's not, you can't do that and be a present, active parent that I love. And I love that responsibility. And so, I'm loving my current task in Brampton and not looking for a career change. I want to make Brampton the best that it can be. I want to make us an example for other municipalities. And I would note on that note, Andrew, We are the only big city in Canada that has run 4 consecutive tax freezes. And we're doing a lot of incredible work. We're thinking outside of the box, and I'm proud of the example that we're setting in Brampton.
I just got my property tax bill, so I might start looking up places in Brampton if you keep up that record.
Well, we want to encourage people. Brampton's open. Brampton is open for every investment, every resident, and we're trying to, I think on a lot of issues, actually, it's been interesting in Brampton. We've really started a conversation, and we started, on property taxation. We're challenging the orthodox of how municipalities approach property taxes. Everyone said you can't freeze taxes. We ran value for money audits, and we have. On some important provincial and federal conversations, I think we're leading the charge. I lead a community that is probably the most diverse in Canada, over 70% visible minorities, a mosaic of faiths. And we've led a campaign across the country on challenging Bill 21, which is an attack on religious freedom. And so, I look at some of the exciting work that I get to embark upon here in Brampton, and I feel very fortunate to be able to really dive into these issues. And so, I love being in Brampton, and there's a lot of rewarding work you can do on the municipal level.
Good. Well, I appreciate you joining to share about some of that work and also some of the bigger picture things affecting people in communities across the province and also the country. Patrick Brown, Mayor of Brampton. Thanks so much, Patrick. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.